President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo saying the Philippines and the United States staged a joint raid at a Manila hotel early on Friday. She said the Bayview Hotel is located just in front of the U.S. Embassy, but Mrs. Arroyo gave no other details.
And of course, the question remains tonight, how? How were the terrorists able to plan and carry out these attacks? Slowly, possible answers are beginning to come clear. Sheila McVicker has that.
As the FBI continues its investigations and police forces around the world seek clues to the identities of the hijackers, it is already possible to say some things about the kind of operation required to carry out these attacks. Attacks, analysts say, that must have been at least months, possibly years, in the planning.
They've chosen their target very carefully. They've assessed the level of security at the points of departure for all of these aircraft. They've done their homework very well indeed.
If the hijackers and their handlers, investigators suggest perhaps as many as 50 people came from outside the United States, their first problem was documents, passports, identities that would permit them to enter the U.S. without detection, setting off no alarm bells. And that, analysts say, would not have been difficult.
Infiltrating using false documentation, using identity theft is relatively easy and requires some planning, but it's not impossible to get access to that in many parts of the world.
Months or even years ago, they would have slipped into communities trained to attract no attention, perhaps not even knowing, say terrorism experts, there were others who would be involved in the plot. And to evade American electronic eavesdropping, there would have been little telephone contact. Instead, months spent in planning and study, searching flight guides for long-haul flights, flights heavy with explosive fuel, and testing again and again airport security.
I would suspect that they would have had months of reconnaissance to see and test and probe the security of getting the weaponry on board.
It's quite possible that maybe these hijackers have carried out a trial run or several trial runs, taking the weapons that we believe at this moment that they had on board through security checkpoints time and again to see how often, how easy it is to do.
Little was left to chance, even the risk of failure minimized by hijacking so many planes. Investigators say at least some of those involved were pilots. At least 2 suspects are known to have trained on a flight simulator. And some aviation security consultants suggest they may have used a widely available computer game to practice flying.
The first attack was apparently coming sort of straight down Manhattan.
A computer game that could take a terrorist right to his target.
When you got there in real life, you'd feel like you've been there before. You would know what you were looking for.
A game that even provides precise geographic coordinates. The reconnaissance, the planning, and the execution, this all cost money and required sophisticated skills. Security analysts and intelligence sources say this may not have been carried out by one group alone. They do not rule out, they say, the involvement of a state in helping organize this. Sheila McVicker, CNN, London.
U.S. officials now saying that military reserve troops could be called up to help assist with the response to the national emergency. For more on how the Pentagon is responding, let's go there, where CNN's Mark Potter is standing by. Mark.
Hello, Jim. Pentagon sources say that President Bush is considering calling up as many as 50,000 military reservists to help in the disaster relief effort and to provide relief also for National Guard pilots who have been flying combat air missions, air patrols rather, around the country. Pentagon official cautioned tonight, though, that this should not be seen by the public as any sort of indication that a military intervention, a military action is imminent. Now, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said that U.S. military pilots continue to fly those combat air patrols in the Washington, D.C., New York City corridor, and that pilots are on standby in what they call a 15-minute strip alert at 26 bases around the country. On CNN's Larry King Live, the secretary said that any U.S. military response would be long range and should not be seen as mere retaliation.
I don't think of it as retaliation. I don't think of it as punishment. I think of it as self-defense. The United States of America has every right to defend itself, and that is what it is about. It is consciously saying that countries and entities and people who actively oppose the United States and damage our interests by acts of violence, acts of war, are our enemies, and they are people and organizations and entities and states that we have every right to defend ourselves against.
Now, here at the Pentagon, officials estimate that the death toll here in this building is approximately 190 people. Those killed, that includes those killed aboard the plane, and those killed in the building mostly come from the Army and the Navy, and from the civilian worker corps associated with the Army and the Navy. About 70 bodies have been recovered here so far. As of late this afternoon, about half of them had been driven over to the Dover Air Force Base mortuary in Delaware. Now, the recovery effort was interrupted temporarily tonight because of a fire that broke out here in the building. It flared up for a short while before firefighters, as you can see here, went to work and they were able to put that fire out fairly quickly. The fire in general in this building is under control, but there are still some hot spots that do flare up occasionally. 24 hours a day, workers are here. They're here at this hour, still going through the rubble, trying to shore up the building, looking for victims. This afternoon, the county fire chief said that officials thought that they had heard the pinging of a black box, but they were unable to locate it. We're looking at a live shot now of the building, and you can see that the fire is indeed out. But workers are still in there now looking for that black box. Investigators hope that by finding the cockpit voice recorder or the data recorder, they can put together some answers as to how this hijacking and the attack on this building occurred. Jim and Colleen, back to you.
All right, Mark Parter, thank you for that report. We want to now take a moment and bring you up to date on the most important news we're following right now, and that is, of course, is the investigation of Tuesday's attacks. Authorities have arrested at least 8 people at New York City's 2 major airports amid concerns over the threat of another hijacking. Authorities say that 4 of the arrested were seen at one of the airports the day of the attacks. Law enforcement sources tell CNN the 4 fled as they were challenged at the ticket counter. Police say they took the suspects into custody on Thursday for carrying forged documents that included a counterfeit pilot's license. Now, that comes as rescuers are working around the clock, hoping to find survivors of the attack at the World Trade Center. But officials say hopes are fading fast. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani saying around 4,700 people are still missing. U.S. President George W. Bush visits New York City on Friday. In an emotional appeal, Mr. Bush vowed Thursday that Washington will not relent until all of those connected to these attacks are held accountable.
All right, more now on that investigation for you. We are joined from Memphis by a man who knows how investigations like the one being carried out in the United States are actually conducted. Weldon Kennedy is a former deputy director of the FBI. Mr. Kennedy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Colleen.
Officials telling us now that the 18 people, the 18 hijackers, have actually been identified. So in terms of the investigation, what step would be next?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What step would be next in terms of the investigation once those people have been identified?
Obviously, these 18 had to have a support mechanism. Where did they stay? How did they get their money? What kind of banking did they do? Who supported them and assisted them in obtaining any kind of identification that they may have used? The list could almost be endless. Because they were in the country evidently for quite some period of time. We know for a fact that they were down in Florida, at least 2 or 3 of them, taking flying lessons, among other things. So it's a very, very large number of investigative leads that need to be followed up. And as each lead is followed up, it will generate additional leads. So it's sort of like a progressive growth. One lead leads to 2 leads, leads to 6, to 8, to 20, and it goes on.
Well, and Mr. Kennedy, I mean, does the fact that because this was such a sophisticated operation and people were in the country for a long period of time, as you point out, does that make it easier for investigators or harder in that they have this volume of material to deal with?
Well, it makes it easier in some ways because, again, everything that they did in terms of a rather lengthy period of time in terms of communications, banking, where they lived, what kind of licenses they had, and so forth, they have created a rather significant trail that now the investigators must uncover and develop all of the information. It makes it, of course, a huge amount of information that has to be developed concerning their activities, but it is a very rich field that the investigators are going to be able to work.
You know, how do investigators get information from people? I mean, today we're hearing about other people arrested at other airports who may or may not be connected with this.
I have a little bit of concern about some of those reports I'm hearing. I know that in Oklahoma City, for example, in the first 5 or 6 days following the Oklahoma City bombing, particularly after we released the drawings of the unknown subjects, we received all kinds of reports all over the nation, and in fact, many individuals were in fact taken into custody by law enforcement authorities who thought they were in fact taking into custody an unknown subject when that proved not to be the case, not to be true.
Mr. Kennedy, what if this ends up involving more than one group? What if there turns out to be a state behind it? How does that complicate things for investigators?
Well, obviously it means that there's going to be a significant international portion added to this case. At this point, there's a huge amount of domestic investigation going on in the United States. Obviously, and it's already become somewhat international. I'm hearing about investigation in Germany, and obviously as this case expands, there may very well be many different countries wherein there will have to be investigative activity.
Yeah, the Philippines as well. Well then, Kennedy, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, the heightened security across the U.S. is having a ripple effect on transportation from neighboring countries as well. U.S. Customs and immigration officials have intensified their scrutiny of vehicles and of passengers who are trying to enter the United States. Cars and trucks at various entry ports from Canada are experiencing long waits, sometimes lasting as much as 12 hours. Ontario's Transportation Ministry urges motorists to postpone travel to the United States. There have also been delays along the border with Mexico.
Well, meantime, air transport gradually being restored after Tuesday's ban on all commercial flights in U.S. airspace. Many airports and airlines resuming operations on a limited basis on Thursday, with travelers facing strict new security measures. Most airlines limited their flights to completion of those that were diverted after Tuesday's attacks. New York's 3 major airports opened briefly, but then were shut down after the FBI detained one person at Kennedy International Airport. Authorities say he tried to pass through security with false documents identifying him as a pilot. Well, Frank Buckley has been monitoring the situation at Los Angeles Airport. He's joining us from there now live. Frank?
Jim, LAX did reopen today, but with a very limited schedule. On an average day here, you have some 2,100 flights today. Airport officials tell me there were less than 100 flights going in or out of Los Angeles. Still, there are some flights, and even at this hour here in Terminal 4 at American Airlines, there are people attempting to go home, many of these people having to spend the past few difficult days away from loved ones. But this morning, the first of the arriving passengers into Los Angeles came here aboard an Alitalia flight. It had been diverted to Canada on Tuesday. Today, it finally arrived in LA, bringing with it reunions, families together again. CNN's Chris Burns has more.
Sighs and cries of relief that loved ones on an Alitalia flight from Milan to Los Angeles during the terror attacks weren't hijacked themselves. They were diverted to Calgary, Canada. Nunzia Bologna stayed calm, but her sister on the ground was terrified.
But we was scared when we heard the news. So thank you, God, everything is okay now.
The plane finally made it to Los Angeles International Airport Thursday, the first passenger flight here since the terror attacks. On Tuesday's flight, the passengers only knew they were being diverted until one of them called an operator on her cell phone. Her parents didn't know she switched to a direct flight